So you have to hear about this guy, Jeffrey Stambovsky, because his story is probably one of the weirdest things to ever happen in a courtroom. We are talking about a guy who actually sued a ghost, and against all odds, he basically won. Well, technically he sued the person who sold him a house, but the whole case was about whether or not the house was haunted. This all went down in a place called Nyack, which is a nice little town in New York. The house was this beautiful, big Victorian place located at 1 Levita Place. It looked like the perfect dream home, right on the water. In 1989, Jeffrey Stambovsky decided he wanted to buy it. He was coming from New York City, and he wanted a nice place in the suburbs. He saw this house and fell in love with it. He signed a contract to buy it for $650,000, which was a lot of money back then. He even put down a deposit of $32,500. He thought he was just buying a normal, classic house, but there was a big piece of information that the seller, a woman named Helen Ackley, didn't tell him. You see, Helen had lived in that house for a long time, about 20 years, and she was convinced the place was crawling with ghosts. Now, Helen didn't just think the house was haunted in private, she actually made a huge deal about it for years. She told the local newspapers all about the spirits living with her. She even had a story published in Reader's Digest back in 1977 where she described the ghost in detail. She said there were at least 3 of them. One was a guy with a mustache who wore a suit from the American Revolution era. She claimed these ghosts would wake her kids up by shaking their beds. She said they would leave gifts for the family and even help out with some of the housework in their own weird way. The whole town of Nyack knew about the ghost house. It was even part of a local walking tour. The problem was that Jeffrey Stambovsky was not from Nyack. He was an outsider. He had no idea about the local legends or the newspaper articles. He just saw a nice house and signed the papers. It wasn't until after the contract was signed and the deposit was paid that he started hearing the rumors. People in town started telling him about the ghosts. He realized that he had just committed to spending over $500,000 on a house that the seller had publicly claimed was haunted for decades. Jeffrey was not happy about this at all. He didn't want to live in a house with a reputation for being haunted, whether the ghosts were real or not. He felt like the house was worth less because of that reputation. He tried to get out of the deal, but Helen Ackley wouldn't give him his deposit back. She basically said that it was his job to check the house out before he signed. So Jeffrey did what any angry New Yorker would do. He sued her. When the case first went to court, things didn't look good for Jeffrey. The lower court judge looked at the case and basically told him he was out of luck. In New York, there's this old legal rule called caveat emptor. That is just a fancy Latin way of saying buyer beware. Basically, the rule says that the seller doesn't have to tell the buyer about problems with the house unless the buyer specifically asks. It's the buyer's responsibility to inspect the place. The judge said that since there's no way to legally prove ghosts exist, the seller didn't have a duty to mention them. He dismissed the case and told Jeffrey he had to go through with the sale or lose his money. But Jeffrey didn't stop there. He took the case to the New York Supreme Court's appellate division. This is where things got really interesting. The judges there looked at the facts and realized this wasn't a normal situation. They saw that Helen Ackley had spent years telling everyone the house was haunted. She had used that reputation to get attention and probably even some money from the articles she wrote. The judges decided that because she had publicly claimed the house was haunted, she couldn't suddenly pretend it was a normal house when she was trying to sell it to someone from out of town. One of the judges, a guy named Justice Israel Rubin, wrote a very famous opinion on this. He actually started it off with a joke about Ghostbusters, which is pretty funny for a serious legal document. He argued that a normal house inspection wouldn't find a ghost. You can't hire a guy to come in with a flashlight and a ladder and find spirits in the attic. Since Jeffrey couldn't have known about the haunting through a standard inspection, and since Helen was the one who created the reputation in the first place, the court felt it was unfair to hold Jeffrey to the contract. The court made a very specific ruling. They said that, as a matter of law, the house was haunted. Now, they weren't saying that they believed in actual ghosts or spooky spirits. They were saying that because the owner had insisted it was haunted for so long, the house legally had that status. This meant that the haunting was a defect that the seller had to disclose. Because she didn't tell him, Jeffrey was allowed to back out of the deal. In the end, Jeffrey Stambovsky got his deposit back and he didn't have to buy the house. He walked away from the whole mess. Helen Ackley eventually sold the house to someone else, and that person didn't seem to mind the ghosts as much.